They called him the King of New York, a man who ended lives with a glance and built empires on silence. But that night at Castello Noir, Robert Morty didn't want blood. He wanted a show. He looked at the trembling waitress, who had just shattered a $4,000 baccarat decanter across his lap, and he smiled. Not a kind smile, the kind that made grown men lose bladder control. He pointed to the empty stage. The microphone stood there like a dare. "You killed my evening," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, velvet soaked in ice. "So save it. If you can sing the Queen of the Night aria right now in front of everyone, I'll marry you. I'll make you untouchable." He leaned in. "If you caw," the smile returned, "you disappear." The room didn't breathe. He smirked. He crossed his arms. He sat back like a man who had already won. He had no idea who she was. He had no idea what that voice could do. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happens next will wreck you. The rain over Manhattan that November night wasn't falling. It was punishing. It hammered the blacked-out windows of Castello Noir, a supper club so exclusive it didn't have a website, a sign, or a front-facing door. To the city, it didn't exist. To those who moved in shadows, it was the only truly neutral ground left on the East Coast, a place where rival families ate within feet of each other and nobody reached for a weapon, because the chandeliers overhead cost more than most people's lives, and nobody wanted to be responsible for the dry-cleaning bill. Lauren adjusted the stiff collar of her uniform, white shirt, black bow tie, red apron, and steadied her breath. 6 months. She had worked here 6 months and the fear never left. She was 23, with dark eyes that saw too much and hands that were rough not from laziness, but from work, 2 jobs, sometimes 3, always moving, always invisible. That was the job, be invisible. Table 7, Lauren, Bordeaux refill. And for the love of God, her floor manager, a tightly wound man named Mr. Hargrove, breathed into her ear. Do not make eye contact with the man at the head of the table. Lauren's stomach dropped. She already knew which table. Everybody knew which table. Robert Morty sat at the head of it like a king who had grown tired of his own kingdom. 34 years old, devastatingly still, the kind of stillness that wasn't peace, but control. He had sharp features, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, and eyes the color of gunmetal in low light. His legitimate empire, Morty Global Freight, was on the cover of Forbes twice. His other empire was never written about anywhere. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. The club had flown in a celebrated soprano, Elena Vasari, from Milan, a personal favor to Robert, who, according to kitchen gossip, had once walked out of a Met Gala the moment the second act began and declared the soprano technically sufficient but emotionally empty. But 10 minutes ago, word tore through the kitchen like fire. Vasari's flight was grounded. The storm, JFK, was closed. The stage was empty. The microphone waited. And Robert Morty, a man who had not been denied anything in over a decade, was sitting at that table, not shouting, not threatening, just still, which was infinitely worse. Lauren picked up the decanter. Crystal, heavy, worth more than her month's rent. Pour from the right, disappear to the left, don't exist. She approached table 7. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the empty stage, a silver lighter turning slowly between 2 fingers, his expression unreadable. The men around him, 6 of them, all in dark suits, sat with the rigid energy of people waiting for a storm to break. "Where is she?" Robert asked, not to anyone, to the room. "Storm, boss," muttered a thick-necked man to his right. "JFK's backed up 3 hours easy." "I didn't ask about the storm." The lighter stopped turning. Lauren reached the table. She leaned in carefully, right side, smooth pour, don't rattle the glass, don't. The thick-necked man slammed a fist on the table. It happened in half a second. The vibration cracked up through the linen. Lauren's grip slipped on the sweat-slicked crystal neck of the decanter. She gasped, reached, overcorrected. The decanter hit the table's edge. It didn't just spill. It exploded. Dark red wine arced through the air in a perfect, terrible crescent, and landed directly across the front of Robert Morty's bespoke charcoal suit. The restaurant went silent. Not quiet, silent. The pianist's hands lifted from the keys mid-note. Silverware stopped. Somewhere near the bar, a glass was set down with extraordinary care. Lauren stood paralyzed, the shattered neck of the decanter still in her hand, her face completely bloodless. Robert did not move. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, slowly, deliberately, as if confirming something he already knew. Then he raised his eyes to hers. His expression was terrifyingly, impossibly calm. Lauren's voice was almost nothing. I'm so sorry, sir. I'll get a cloth, Stop. She stopped. He rose from his chair without urgency. He stood over her, not violently, which somehow made it worse, and reached down to lift a curved shard of broken crystal from the tablecloth. He turned it in the candlelight, set it down. You know, he said, addressing the room in that low, unhurried voice, I've had a very specific kind of terrible evening. His eyes returned to Lauren. My entertainment is grounded at JFK, my patience left with her, and now, he gestured once at his chest, almost elegantly, this. Lauren bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper. She would not cry, not here, not in front of these men. Your name, he said. Lauren. He let the name sit in the air a moment. Lauren, something moved behind those gunmetal eyes, not warmth, calculation. My men have a standard response for situations like this. You understand that. She understood. Everyone in the room understood. But I'm in an unusual mood tonight. He turned slowly toward the empty stage, the microphone, the single spotlight still aimed at nothing. Then he looked back at her. That stage needs a singer. You've taken mine. Lauren blinked. Sir, I'm a waitress. You were, he said. Now you're auditioning. A nervous ripple moved through the seated men. Get on the stage, Lauren. Sing something. Sing anything that doesn't embarrass this room. The cruel edge of a smile appeared. If you can actually sing, if you can give me the Queen of the Night aria and mean it, I'll call us even. More than even. A pause that felt carved from stone. I'll marry you tonight. You'll have a name that no one in this city would dare touch. One of the men at the table let out a short, disbelieving laugh. It died instantly under Robert's sideways glance. And if I can't, Lauren asked. Her voice was barely a sound. Robert's almost smile disappeared completely. Then you spend the next 10 years working off the cost of that suit. The room understood what that meant. Lauren looked at the stage. She looked at the microphone. She looked at Robert Morty, the most dangerous man in the most dangerous room in New York, and something moved across her face that he didn't expect. It wasn't surrender. Robert Morty had broken hundreds of people in that pause between the threat and the answer. He knew exactly what fear looked like when it caved. This wasn't that. Deal, she said. He blinked barely, just once, and reached for a clean glass. He was certain she was about to humiliate herself. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. Lauren's heels clicked against the hardwood stage like a countdown. Every eye in Castello Noir tracked her, the men at table 7 with barely concealed amusement, the other waitstaff frozen near the walls like paintings, the bartender who had quietly stopped polishing the same glass 3 minutes ago. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the rain punishing the windows and the soft creak of Lauren's weight settling onto the stage. She looked out at the room. 40-something faces stared back. The most dangerous collection of human beings in the northeastern United States, and every single one of them was waiting for her to fail. Robert Morty sat with one arm draped over his chair, the fresh glass of Bordeaux untouched on the table, watching her the way a man watches a match being held near paper. Curious, patient, already certain of the outcome. Lauren wrapped both hands around the microphone stand. She closed her eyes. What happened next, nobody in that room would fully agree on when they tried to describe it later. Some said she simply opened her mouth. Others swore there was a moment, a single suspended second, where the air in the room changed, like pressure shifting before lightning, where the woman in the red apron stopped being a waitress and became something else entirely. Then she sang. The first note of Dare Hurl, Rake hit the room like a physical force. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't polished the way a concert hall performance is polished, careful and controlled and served on velvet. It was alive. It cracked open the silence like a fault line splitting stone, soaring up into the upper register with a precision and raw, aching fury that made the crystal pendants on the chandelier tremble. One of Robert's men, the thick-necked one who had caused the whole disaster, pressed back in his chair without realizing he'd moved. Lauren didn't perform the aria. She weaponized it. Every run, every impossible coloratura climb, every sustained high note landed not like music, but like testimony. The testimony of someone who had been swallowing something enormous for a very long time and had finally, in the worst possible room on the worst possible night, been handed a reason to let it out. When the final note dissolved into silence, Lauren opened her eyes. Nobody clapped, nobody moved. Robert Morty was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read, not amusement anymore, not cruelty. Something stripped back and unguarded that lasted only a moment before the mask returned. He reached up slowly and removed the heavy obsidian signet ring from his right hand. He stood. He walked to the stage without a word. He set the ring on the edge of the platform, directly in front of her feet. Then he looked up. A deal is a deal, he said quietly. The penthouse sat 63 floors above Manhattan, and from up here the city looked like something that couldn't hurt you. Lauren knew better. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, still in her wine-stained uniform, her bow tie undone and hanging loose around her collar, watching the rain streak down the glass in crooked lines. Behind her, she could hear Robert moving, the quiet clink of crystal, the soft pour of something expensive, the unhurried rhythm of a man entirely at home in his own power. She had not been afraid on that stage. She was afraid now. Sit down, Lauren. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't cruel either. She turned and sat on the edge of a charcoal sofa that probably cost more than her entire apartment building, and accepted the glass of water he set in front of her without comment. He sat across from her, jacket off now, the wine-ruined shirt replaced, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and for a long moment he simply looked at her the way he had at the stage, like he was recalculating something. You've been trained, he said finally. Conservatory level, you didn't learn that in a Queen's diner. Lauren said nothing. Manhattan School of Music, he continued, as though reading from a file. Full scholarship, withdrawn at 19. Father's name Daniel Russo, logistics contractor, died in a warehouse fire in Red Hook 4 years ago. He paused, ruled accidental. Lauren's hands tightened in her lap. It wasn't accidental, she said quietly. Robert held her gaze. No, it was. The words landed like something she had always known but never heard spoken aloud, and the space behind her sternum cracked open in a way she hadn't let it in 4 years. She breathed through it. She kept her face still. Victor Sterling, Robert said. The name came out flat, stripped of drama, which somehow made it worse. He used your father's freight routes to move product up the eastern seaboard. When Daniel found out what he was actually carrying, when he threatened to go to the authorities, Sterling had the warehouse torched with him inside and called it an electrical fault. Lauren stared at the untouched water glass. Why are you telling me this? Because Sterling is the same man who has been quietly dismantling my family's operations for 2 years. Robert leaned forward, forearms on his knees. And because a grieving daughter with a reason to get close to him is something my lawyers cannot be. The room was very quiet. You want to use me, Lauren said. I want to offer you a contract, he replied. Protection, resources, a name that opens every door in the city. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And a path directly to the man who killed your father. Lauren finally looked up. Show me the contract. The contract was 42 pages long. Lauren read every word. Robert sat across the mahogany desk in his study and didn't rush her, didn't drum his fingers or check his watch or offer commentary. He simply waited, with the particular stillness of a man who understood that patience was its own form of power. A single lamp burned between them, casting the room in amber and shadow, and outside the rain had finally softened to something quieter, almost apologetic. She turned the last page. The terms were precise to the point of being surgical. A legal marriage, registered and legitimate, effective within 72 hours. Lauren would receive a penthouse residence in the Morty building on Central Park West, a monthly allowance that made her stomach tighten with something between relief and fury, full use of the Morty name, and round-the-clock protection from a dedicated security detail. She would attend designated social functions as Robert's wife. She would be visible, elegant, and entirely untouchable. In return, she would ask no questions about operations. She would sign a confidentiality agreement covering everything she had already heard tonight. She would play the role flawlessly for as long as the arrangement required. There was a clause on page 31 that she read twice. This agreement constitutes a professional arrangement only. No romantic expectation is implied, assumed, or permitted by either party. She almost laughed, almost. "You had this drafted before tonight," she said. Robert didn't deny it. "I had several versions drafted. You're not the first person Sterling has left unfinished business with. But I'm the one you chose." "You're the one who chose yourself," he said, "on that stage." Lauren set the contract down and picked up the pen. It was heavy, solid silver, monogrammed, and it felt obscene in her rough, work-worn hand. She was aware of exactly what she was signing, not just her name, her old life. The invisibility she had hidden inside for 4 years, the smallness she had worn like armor. She signed. Robert signed beneath her without ceremony, capped his pen, and pressed the Morty seal into the wax at the bottom of the final page. The obsidian signet ring, the same one he had placed on the stage 2 hours ago, caught the lamplight as he pressed it down. He slid one copy across the desk toward her. "Welcome to the family," he said. The word landed with deliberate irony, though something beneath it was harder to name. Lauren folded her copy carefully and met his eyes across the desk. In the amber light, without the crowd and the performance and the threat, he looked almost human, almost tired, like a man carrying something heavy that he had long ago stopped expecting anyone to notice. She picked up her copy and stood. "Just so we're clear," she said quietly, "I'm not a chess piece." Robert looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said finally, "you're not." The woman in the mirror was a stranger. Lauren stood very still in the dressing room of the Morty building's private suite, while a team of 4 moved around her with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that what they were constructing was not an outfit, but a weapon. The gown was crimson, deep, arterial red, with a structured bodice and a train that moved like water when she turned. Her dark hair had been pinned into an architectural sweep at the base of her neck, 2 loose pieces framing her face with the kind of effortless precision that took 90 minutes to achieve. She looked like someone who had never scrubbed a floor in her life. She looked like someone you didn't cross. Robert appeared in the doorway behind her, reflected in the mirror. He was in black tie, immaculate, unhurried, and his eyes moved over her once with the practiced assessment of a man checking that a strategy was correctly deployed. Not cruelty, not admiration, calculation. "Sterling will be there tonight," he said. "Third-year donor to the Met Foundation. He'll have his security detail and at least 2 of his lawyers within arm's reach at all times." Lauren watched his reflection. "And what exactly am I supposed to do?" "Exist," Robert said, "visibly on my arm. Let the room see that Lauren Morty is real, is present, and is someone worth knowing." He paused. "Sterling is meticulous. He'll want to assess any new variable in my life personally. He'll find a way to get close. And when he does..." "You smile. You are charming and warm and completely unconcerned." His jaw tightened slightly. "And you remember everything he says." Lauren turned from the mirror to face him directly. "You're using me as bait." "I'm using you as intelligence," he said, and the distinction in his voice was careful, deliberate. "There's a difference. Bait is expendable. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "You won't be unprotected, not for a single second of that evening." She held his gaze long enough to decide she believed him, then turned back to the mirror. The stylist stepped forward with a final piece, a necklace, a single strand of dark rubies set in oxidized gold, dramatic and understated at once. As the clasp settled against Lauren's collarbone, she felt the weight of it like a declaration. She thought about her father, about a warehouse in Red Hook, about a fire that was never an accident and a death that was never investigated the way it should have been. She thought about Victor Sterling moving through a gilded room tonight, untouchable, celebrated, utterly certain that Daniel Russo's daughter was buried in the same obscurity as his memory. She picked up the small clutch from the vanity. "Then let's not keep him waiting," she said. Robert almost smiled. Almost. The Metropolitan Museum was drowning in candlelight. 1,200 guests moved through the great hall in silk and diamonds, champagne flutes catching the glow of 1,000 flames, the air thick with perfume, and the particular electricity of people performing wealth for each other. A string quartet played somewhere above the crowd, delicate and decorative, like music that understood its place. Lauren understood hers. She moved through the room on Robert's arm with a stillness she had spent years perfecting, not the stillness of fear, but of someone who had learned long ago that invisible was safer than seen. Tonight, she wore it differently. Tonight, invisible was the last thing she was supposed to be. People noticed. Of course they noticed. The new Mrs. Morty, stunning in arterial red, materializing from nowhere on the arm of the most quietly feared man in the room. She caught the whispers at the edges of her vision, the turned heads, the phones discreetly tilted, the sharp appraising looks from women who had built careers out of knowing exactly who belonged and who didn't. She smiled at all of it, warmly, effortlessly. Robert had been right about Sterling. He found her within 40 minutes. She felt him before she saw him, a subtle shift in the social geometry of the room, the way a cluster of guests near the North Gallery parted with just a fraction too much deference. Then Victor Sterling stepped into her peripheral vision, and Lauren had exactly 3 seconds to compose herself before he was close enough to shake hands. He was not what she expected. He was silver-haired and patrician, with the easy tan of someone who wintered somewhere warm and the kind of smile that read as genuine until you looked at the eyes behind it. He was 60, perhaps, but carried it like a man who had decided aging was optional. He wore his philanthropy the way he wore his tuxedo, perfectly fitted, designed to be admired. "Robert," he clasped Robert's hand with both of his, the performance of old friendship. "And this must be the extraordinary Lauren." His attention moved to her like a searchlight finding its target. "The room hasn't stopped talking about you." "The room is easily entertained," Lauren said pleasantly. Sterling laughed, a rich, rehearsed sound. His eyes didn't laugh at all. They shook hands. His grip was precise, measured, and 2 seconds longer than necessary. Long enough for him to study her face with an attention that had nothing to do with admiration. Something moved behind those pale eyes. A flicker, a door opening and closing in the space of a heartbeat. He leaned in slightly, dropping his voice beneath the music. "You have your father's eyes," he said softly. "Has anyone ever told you that?" The champagne flute in Lauren's hand didn't tremble. She made absolutely certain of it. "I wouldn't know," she said, holding his gaze without blinking. "He died before I got the chance to ask." Sterling smiled slowly. "Yes," he said, "he did." The first shot came from the mezzanine. Lauren didn't hear it so much as feel it, a sharp displacement of air 2 inches from her left ear, followed by the crystalline explosion of a champagne flute 3 feet away. For one suspended second, the great hall didn't understand what had happened. Then someone screamed, and 1,200 people remembered all at once that they were mortal. The room collapsed into chaos. Robert's hand closed around Lauren's wrist before she had finished processing the sound, iron firm. No hesitation. And he was already moving, pulling her low and fast through the surge of panicking bodies toward the north corridor. Behind them, she heard 2 more shots, suppressed but unmistakable now that she knew what to listen for, and then the heavy percussion of Robert's security team returning fire from somewhere near the entrance. "Don't stop," Robert said, not loudly. He didn't need to. She didn't stop. They moved through a service corridor she hadn't known existed, past stunned catering staff pressing themselves against the walls, through a steel door that opened with a code Robert punched from memory, and down a stairwell that smelled of stone and old metal. Lauren's heels hit the steps in sharp, rapid bursts, and she reached down mid-stride, snapped both off at the ankle strap without breaking pace, and kept running in bare feet on cold concrete. The black SUV was already running in the loading bay. Dominic, Robert's head of security, a man Lauren had exchanged approximately 11 words with since the contract signing, had the rear door open before they cleared the bottom step. Robert pushed Lauren in first, followed immediately, and the vehicle was moving before the door fully closed. "2 shooters confirmed on the mezzanine," Dominic said from the front, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone delivering information rather than experiencing it. "Both sterling. We have one down. The other is in the wind." Robert said nothing. He was looking at Lauren. She was staring at her hands in her lap, the ruined dress pooling around her like a crime scene, and she was breathing, carefully, deliberately, the way she had learned to breathe through the highest passages of the most technically brutal arias. Because if she stopped controlling her breath, she was going to start shaking, and she refused to do that in front of these men. "Lauren." She looked up. His expression was not what she expected. Not strategy, not calculation, something tighter than that and more human. "Are you hit?" "No," she said. Then, because her voice had come out steadier than she felt, she said it again. "No, I'm fine." He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then looked away. The city blurred past the tinted windows, the lit towers, the wet streets, the ordinary Manhattan night continuing entirely without them, and Lauren watched it recede as the SUV crossed the bridge and kept moving. South, then east, then onto roads that grew quieter and darker and eventually became something that felt less like escape and more like disappearance. The safe house was a converted boathouse on the Connecticut shore, gray-shingled and unremarkable, crouched at the edge of the water like something that had decided long ago not to be found. The rain had followed them the entire way. Inside, someone had left lights on low and a first aid kit open on the kitchen table. Lauren saw the dark stain spreading through Robert's sleeve before he did. "You're hit," she said. He looked down. "Apparently," he said quietly. She had never stitched a wound before. Robert talked her through it with the same unhurried calm he applied to everything, quietly, precisely, without drama, while Lauren's hands moved under the low kitchen light and the rain pressed against the boathouse windows like it was trying to get in. The bullet had carved a clean furrow across the outside of his upper arm, deep enough to bleed seriously, not deep enough to kill, which Lauren understood was the only category of injury Robert Morty considered worth acknowledging. "Smaller stitches," he said. "I'm aware," she said. "You're pulling. You've been shot. It's supposed to feel like something." He almost smiled. She felt it more than saw it, a slight shift in the tension around his jaw, and kept her eyes on her work, because looking at his face from this distance felt like a different kind of exposure entirely. She had changed out of the ruined gown into a shirt and sweatpants from the safe house's emergency supplies, and without the red dress and the rubies she felt like herself again, which was both a relief and a vulnerability she hadn't anticipated. He had removed his jacket and dress shirt, and the man sitting on the edge of the kitchen table in the half-dark was stripped of the architecture that made him Robert Morty. No suit, no room to command. Just a man with old scars, layered beneath new ones and eyes, that watched her work with an attention that had stopped being clinical several minutes ago. "You've done this before," she said, nodding at the scars. "The stitches, someone done them for you before." "My father," he said. "When I was 17, he believed hospitals created records. And now? Now I have people for it, a beat, usually." Lauren tied off the last stitch, set the needle down, and pressed a clean square of gauze firmly against the closed wound. His hand came up automatically to hold it in place, and his fingers briefly covered hers before she pulled back. Neither of them mentioned it. She began wrapping the bandage, and Robert looked at the middle distance with the expression of someone deciding whether to speak. When he did, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of its professional architecture the way the rest of him had been stripped of his suit. "My father trusted the wrong lawyer," he said. "Sterling was the one who told him the meeting was safe, the one who arranged the location." He paused. "I've known for 3 years. Building a case that can't be dismantled takes longer than grief would prefer." Lauren's hands slowed on the bandage. She thought about her own 3 years, the diner in Queens, the night shifts, the way she had packed her voice away like something indecent, something too large and too raw to be permitted in the small, careful life she had constructed around her loss. "We're the same," she said quietly. "Not a comfort, just a fact." Robert looked at her then, directly, without the calculation she had come to expect as his default. And for a moment the boathouse felt very small, and the distance between them felt like something that had been decreasing since a stage in a supper club, and neither of them had said so. "Don't," he said softly, but it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a man talking to himself. Lauren secured the bandage and stepped back, putting measured space between them and what the room had almost become. "Get some sleep," she said. "We're not finished yet." The SS Titan sat in the harbor like a floating city that had decided to keep its secrets. 14 decks, 2,000 passengers, and somewhere in the private quarters of Victor Sterling's luxury suite on Deck 12, a ledger containing the names, dates, and transaction records of every human being his network had moved, sold, or disappeared over the past 11 years. Robert had been hunting that ledger for 18 months. Tonight, with Sterling occupied at a private dinner on the upper deck, and his security rotation mapped down to the minute, was the only window they were going to get. Lauren stood at the vanity in their adjoining stateroom and pinned the final piece of her cover into place, a performer's lanyard, forged with the kind of precision that Dominic's team charged a great deal for and never discussed. The ship's entertainment director had announced a surprise classical performance in the Grand Atrium at 9. The booking had been made 6 days ago under a name that didn't exist. The performer was Lauren. "Sterling's detail runs 4 men on Deck 12, Robert said behind her, studying the schematic on his phone with his bandaged arm held slightly away from his body. 2 stationed outside the suite, 2 on rotating perimeter. The rotation gives me 11 minutes between passes. And the dinner runs until 10:30, maybe 11 if the wine is good." He looked up. "I need at least 20. Lauren met his eyes in the mirror. "Then I'll give you 25. She had chosen Casta Diva, Bellini, achingly beautiful, technically demanding enough to justify an encore, familiar enough to hold a crowd of passengers who hadn't come aboard expecting to be moved. But it was the quality of the performance that would determine everything. A mediocre show cleared the atrium in 40 minutes. A transcendent one kept people rooted to the floor, glassy-eyed and reluctant, the way great music did when it found the unguarded places in people and simply sat down inside them. Lauren had spent her entire life being told her voice was too much. Tonight, too much was exactly what was required. The atrium was 3 decks high, all curved white steel and warm light, and when Lauren walked onto the small raised platform at its center, the ambient noise of the ship, the clink and murmur of a floating resort at full occupancy, softened almost immediately. Something about her stillness, something about the way she stood at the microphone like she had been standing at the center of difficult rooms her entire life. She found Robert at the edge of the atrium crowd, already moving toward the corridor that led to the service elevator. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. She turned to the room. She sang. Casta Diva opened like a door into another world, slow, celestial, almost unbearably tender, and Lauren let it build the way Bellini intended, not rushing the architecture of it, trusting the music to do what it had been doing to human beings for 2 centuries. People stopped walking. A woman near the bar set down her drink and didn't pick it up again. 3 crew members who had no reason to linger found reasons. On the second verse, she heard, beneath the music and the silence of the crowd, the faint, distant sound of a door. She didn't look. She moved into the first encore without pause, her voice climbing into the upper register with an ease that drew a soft, collective sound from the crowd, not applause. Something more involuntary than that. And she thought about her father, about Red Hook, about a fire and a ledger and 11 years of names that deserved to be spoken aloud. She gave Robert every second she had promised. She gave him 30. When she finally stepped back from the microphone and the atrium erupted, she saw him reappear at the corridor entrance, unhurried, expression neutral, one hand resting in his jacket pocket. He gave her the smallest nod she had ever seen. They had it. They never made it off the ship. Lauren was halfway down the service corridor toward the tender dock when the door at the far end opened, and Marcus Webb, Robert's lawyer, the man who had drafted the 42-page contract, the man who had been inside the Morty operation for 11 years, stepped through it with 3 of Sterling's guards and an expression of profound, practiced regret. "I'm sorry, Robert," Webb said, and he almost sounded it. Robert went completely still. Lauren counted the variables in the space of a single breath. 3 guards, armed, 1 exit behind them, now compromised. Webb had known the ship layout, the timing, the rotation schedule. He had been inside every planning meeting. He had handed Sterling everything. "The ledger," Webb said, nodding toward Robert's jacket. "And the recording Dominic made at the safe house, all of it." Robert didn't move. "Now," Webb said quietly, "or she goes first." The guard to Webb's left raised his weapon toward Lauren with the bored efficiency of someone performing a routine task, and something clarified inside her with sudden, absolute coldness. Not fear. Something on the other side of fear, the place you arrived at when you had already lost everything once, and survived it and understood, with the hard certainty of scar tissue, that you were capable of more than anyone in this corridor had accounted for. Her eyes moved to the PA junction panel on the wall beside her. Maintenance access, open. The ship's internal audio system, the same system that had carried her voice through the atrium 3 decks above, fed through junction panels exactly like this one throughout every corridor in the vessel. She had noticed it on the way down because she always noticed acoustics. She had spent her entire life reading rooms. She looked at Robert. He read her face in 1 second. "Get down," she said. She pulled the panel open, grabbed the primary feed cable, and connected the handheld microphone she had never relinquished from the performance directly into the raw input. No board, no mixing desk, no filter between her voice and 14 decks of steel amplification. Then she sang. Not Bellini, not Mozart. No melody, no aria, nothing with a name. She opened her throat and produced a single sustained note at the absolute uppermost limit of her soprano range, a frequency she had hit exactly twice in controlled conditions and been told by 2 separate vocal coaches to never attempt inside an enclosed metal space. The cargo corridor was an enclosed metal space. The sound that returned was not music. It was physics. The ship's speakers drove the frequency back at 10 times input volume, hitting the resonant pitch of the surrounding steel with a concussive crack that Lauren felt in her back teeth. The emergency panel beside Webb's head detonated inward. All 3 guards dropped their weapons to cover their ears, 1 man folding to his knees, another thrown sideways into the wall. Webb collapsed against the door frame with both palms pressed to his skull. Robert moved. It was over in seconds. Sterling emerged from the stairwell behind Webb. He had been there the entire time, watching, certain of his outcome, and found Robert already waiting with the ledger in 1 hand and 11 years of accumulated patience in his eyes. Sterling looked past him at Lauren. At the girl from Queens, performer's lanyard, bare feet on cold steel, a microphone in her hand and her father's name burning quietly behind her ribs like something that had never once gone out. "You," Sterling said, recognition, then something rarer in a man like him, fear. "Me," Lauren said. The wedding was held on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera on a Thursday evening in late April, after the season's final performance had cleared the house. No guests except Dominic, who stood at the back with his hands folded, and a single arrangement of white peonies on the conductor's podium that Robert had ordered without explanation, and Lauren had not asked about. The officiant's words were brief. Afterward, Lauren stood alone at the center of the stage and looked out at 1,500 empty seats rising into the dark. The most famous opera house in the world, silent and waiting, not empty, but held, as though the room was still listening. She thought about a wine-stained uniform, a shattered decanter, a smirking man who had issued a wager he was certain he had already won. She thought about her father. She sang one note, soft, unaccompanied, for no one and everyone. It filled every seat in the house. And that is where Lauren's story ends, not in a cargo hold, not in a courtroom, but on the greatest stage in the world, finally taking up every inch of space she was always meant to occupy. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the most dangerous thing in any room is sometimes the person everyone decided not to see. Subscribe and hit the bell right now. The next story is already written. Another room, another woman the world underestimated, another moment when the silence breaks and everything changes. You don't want to come in late, and tell me where you're watching from.